The morning everything changed. There are moments in life that divide your existence into before and after. For Daniel Martinez, that moment arrived on a Tuesday morning, dressed in his gray sweater and bare feet, standing in his living room like she belonged there, like she'd always been there. Like the empty space in his home had been waiting for her shape to fill it. The autumn sun filtered through the curtains, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Daniel had been awake for hours, unable to sleep after the previous night's storm, both the one outside and the one that had brought Natalie Reeves crashing into his carefully ordered life. He'd spent the early hours sitting on his porch, watching the neighborhood wake up, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to understand why a woman he barely knew had shown up at his door soaked to the bone and shaking with more than just cold. He descended the stairs slowly, his hand trailing along the banister his grandfather had carved decades ago. The wood was smooth under his palm, worn by generations of hands, and he drew comfort from its familiarity. Everything else felt uncertain, tilted like the world had shifted on its axis overnight. The coffee he'd made earlier sat forgotten on the kitchen counter, gone cold. The book he'd been reading lay abandoned on the side table. Nothing mattered except the sound of quiet breathing coming from his living room, proof that last night hadn't been a dream. And then he saw her. Natalie stood by the window, one hand resting against the glass, watching the street below with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. She wore his sweater, the oversized gray one with the frayed cuffs that he wore when he needed comfort, when the world felt too sharp and he needed something soft to wrap around himself. On her smaller frame, it hung past her hips, the sleeves covering her hands completely except for the tips of her fingers. She'd rolled them up slightly, revealing delicate wrists and hands that trembled ever so slightly in the morning light. She was barefoot. Daniel noticed that first, the way her toes curled against his hardwood floor, seeking warmth or perhaps grounding. Her legs were pale, exposed from mid-thigh down, and there was something achingly vulnerable about seeing her like this. Dressed in his clothes, in his space, real and present and impossible to look away from. Her hair fell in waves around her shoulders, still damp from the shower she'd taken last night, catching the light in shades of chestnut and copper. She'd pushed it back from her face, revealing features that looked softer in the morning light than they had in last night's harsh overhead glare. High cheekbones, a straight nose, lips pressed together in concentration or perhaps anxiety, and her eyes, when she finally turned and met his gaze, were the color of summer storms, gray-blue and full of lightning. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His heart did something complicated, a stutter step that felt like falling and flying at the same time. He'd seen beautiful women before. He'd even loved one once years ago before life taught him that sometimes love wasn't enough. But this was different. This wasn't about beauty, though Natalie was undeniably beautiful. This was about presence, about the way she seemed to fill his home with possibility, about the way everything in him wanted to move closer while his mind screamed to keep his distance. She noticed him then, standing frozen halfway down the stairs like a statue, and something flickered across her face. Embarrassment, definitely, but also something else. Something that looked like hope mixed with fear, like she was waiting for him to tell her to leave, to take back the sanctuary he'd offered in the chaos of last night's storm. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, rough with sleep and unshed tears. "I couldn't find anything else to wear. My clothes from last night are still wet and I didn't want to wake you, and this was hanging on the bathroom door, so I just—" She stopped, swallowing hard, her hands twisting in the too long sleeves. "I can change. I should change. This is inappropriate. I'm inappropriate. I should just go. Don't." The word came out more forcefully than Daniel intended, sharp enough that Natalie flinched. He softened his tone immediately, taking another step down, then another. "Please don't apologize. And don't go." He moved closer, slowly, the way you'd approach a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden movement. Each step brought new details into focus. The way the sweater's neckline slipped off one shoulder, revealing a collarbone that looked too prominent, suggesting she hadn't been eating enough. The faint bruise on her shin that he'd noticed last night but hadn't asked about. The way she held herself, shoulders slightly hunched as if making herself smaller might make her less of an imposition. When he was close enough to see the gold flecks in her gray-blue eyes, close enough to catch the scent of his soap on her skin, mixed with something uniquely her, something like vanilla and rain and desperation, he stopped. "You look like you fit here," he said quietly, the words escaping before he could examine them, before he could decide if they were too much, too soon, too honest. Natalie's eyes widened. A flush crept up her neck, painting her cheeks pink. "That's a dangerous thing to say to someone like me," she replied, her voice trembling. "Someone who's been looking for a place to fit for longer than you know." Daniel felt something crack open in his chest. Some protective wall he'd built after his last heartbreak, after he'd decided that living alone was safer than risking the pain of losing someone again. Natalie wasn't asking to be saved. She wasn't asking for anything really, except maybe not to be sent away. But everything in him wanted to offer her something anyway. Shelter, safety, time to heal. "A place to fit. My name is Daniel," he said, even though he'd told her that last night, even though she probably remembered. But this felt like a new introduction, like they were meeting again for the first time in this morning light, in this changed context. "Natalie," she replied, and even though he knew her name too, hearing her say it made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I'm Natalie Reeves and I'm a mess. And I showed up at your door last night like some kind of disaster. And I'm wearing your clothes and I have no right to any of this kindness. But I'm so grateful I can barely breathe." The words tumbled out in a rush, like a dam breaking, like she'd been holding them back all night and couldn't contain them anymore. Her hands came up to her face, covering her eyes, and her shoulders shook with silent tears. Daniel closed the remaining distance between them. He didn't touch her. Not yet. Not without permission, but he stood close enough that she could feel his presence. Close enough that she'd know she wasn't alone. "You have every right," he said firmly. "Whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from or toward, you have every right to be safe, to rest, to wear comfortable clothes and drink hot coffee and not have to explain yourself until you're ready." Natalie lowered her hand slowly. Her eyes were red-rimmed, swimming with tears that hadn't quite fallen. She looked at him like she was trying to solve a puzzle, like she couldn't quite believe he was real. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Daniel smiled, small and sad and true. "Maybe I'd like to. Know you, I mean. If you'll let me." The air between them felt charged, electric, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. Daniel could hear his heart pounding in his ears, could feel the weight of this moment pressing down on both of them. This was a choice point, he realized. They could step back now, maintain boundaries, keep this simple and surface level. Or they could lean in, risk the complications, see where this unexpected connection might lead. Natalie bit her lower lip. A gesture Daniel was already learning meant she was wrestling with something internal. Some battle between what she wanted and what she thought she deserved. Then slowly she nodded. "I'd like that too," she whispered. "Even though I probably shouldn't. Even though I'm not good at this, at letting people in. Even though I'm terrified." "That makes two of us," Daniel admitted, and it was true. He was terrified. Terrified of the way she made him feel. Terrified of how quickly his carefully controlled life had been upended. Terrified of what it might mean if he let himself care about someone this broken and this beautiful. But beneath the terror was something else. Something that felt like hope, like possibility, like the first day of spring after a long, brutal winter. Something that whispered maybe, just maybe. They'd both been waiting for this moment without knowing it, had been moving toward each other through all the years and choices and heartbreaks that had led them here. The morning light shifted, growing stronger, warming the room. Somewhere outside, a bird began to sing. The coffee maker beeped in the kitchen, signaling a fresh pot was ready. Life continued around them, indifferent to the magnitude of what was happening in this small living room between two people who'd been strangers 24 hours ago. "Are you hungry?" Daniel asked, breaking the intensity of the moment with something practical, something safe. "I make pretty good pancakes. And there's bacon. And I think I have some strawberries that haven't gone bad yet." Natalie's stomach growled audibly in response. And for the first time since he'd seen her standing in his living room wearing his sweater, she laughed. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but genuine. It transformed her face, chasing away some of the shadows that lived in her eyes. "Pancakes sound perfect," she said. What the storm brought. In 24 hours earlier, Daniel Martinez had been living a perfectly predictable life. At 32, he'd settled into a comfortable routine after the chaos of his 20s. He taught literature at the local community college, spent his weekends refurbishing furniture in his garage workshop, had coffee with his sister every Sunday, and went to bed at a reasonable hour with a book and a cup of chamomile tea. It was a good life, if a quiet one. safe, if perhaps a little lonely. The storm had started building all day, dark clouds gathering on the horizon like an invading army. By evening, the wind was howling through the trees, bending branches and sending leaves spiraling through the air. Rain began as a whisper, then grew to a roar, hammering against windows and flooding gutters. The kind of storm that made you grateful for solid walls and a sturdy roof. That made you think about all the people who didn't have such protection. Daniel had been in his study, grading papers with jazz playing softly in the background when the doorbell rang. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place in the storm's symphony, that at first he thought he'd imagined it. Who would be out in this weather? The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time, followed by frantic knocking. He'd opened the door to find Natalie Reeves standing on his porch, drenched and shaking, her eyes wild with something that looked like panic or desperation or both. Water streamed from her hair, her clothes pooling at her feet. She was holding herself like people do when they're trying to keep from falling apart, arms wrapped tight around her middle, shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. "I'm sorry," she'd gasped out, teeth chattering so hard she could barely form words. "I'm so sorry. I know this is crazy. I know you don't know me. But I saw your light and I needed—" She'd stopped, unable to finish, her face crumpling. Daniel hadn't hesitated. "Come in," he'd said, stepping aside, pulling her into the warmth of his home. "Come in, you're freezing." "It's okay. Whatever it is, it's okay." She'd stumbled inside, leaving wet footprints on his hardwood floor, and he'd noticed then that she was limping, favoring her left leg. Her hands, when she'd tried to push her wet hair from her face, were scraped raw, knuckles bleeding. She was wearing jeans and a thin jacket that offered no protection against the storm's fury, and when he'd gotten close enough to guide her to the couch, he'd smelled fear on her, sharp and acrid beneath the rain and cold. "I'm going to get you dry clothes and towels," Daniel had said, keeping his voice calm and steady even as his mind raced with questions and concerns. "And I'm going to make you something hot to drink. You're safe here. Do you understand? You're safe." Natalie had nodded, unable to speak, tears mixing with the rain on her face. She'd been shaking so violently he'd worried about shock, about hypothermia, about all the things that could go wrong when someone was this cold and this scared. He'd run upstairs, grabbed his warmest sweatpants and the gray sweater, the soft one that had been his father's before he'd passed, the one Daniel wore when he needed to feel protected. He'd gathered towels and his first aid kit, his mind working through the logistics of helping a terrified stranger while giving her space, keeping her comfortable without overwhelming her. When he'd returned to the living room, Natalie had been curled into the corner of his couch, making herself as small as possible, her eyes tracking his movements with the wariness of someone who'd learned that kindness often came with conditions, with expectations, with danger. "The bathroom is just down that hall," he'd said, pointing. "Take as long as you need. There's a lock on the door. I'll be in the kitchen when you're ready." She'd taken the clothes with trembling hands, looking at him like she couldn't quite believe he was real. Like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to transform into something else. But she'd gone to the bathroom and Daniel had heard the lock click, and he'd released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. In the kitchen, he'd made chamomile tea with honey, the kind his mother used to make when he was sick or scared as a child. He'd heated soup, sliced bread, arranged everything on a tray with hands that were steadier than he felt. Through it all, he'd listened for sounds from the bathroom, alert for any sign that she might need help, that things might be worse than they appeared. When Natalie had finally emerged, swimming in his clothes, her hair towel dried but still damp, her face scrubbed clean of makeup and raw with vulnerability, Daniel's heart had done something he couldn't quite name. She'd looked younger without the armor of presentability, younger and more lost and somehow more present than any person he'd met in years. They'd sat in silence while she'd eaten, small careful bites like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. Daniel had watched her hands shake around the mug of tea, had noticed the way she kept glancing at the door, the windows, mapping escape routes even in her exhaustion. He'd recognized the behavior, had seen it in his sister's friend who'd fled an abusive relationship years ago. The hypervigilance, the inability to fully relax, the way safety felt dangerous because safety meant letting your guard down, and letting your guard down meant getting hurt. "Do you need me to call anyone?" he'd asked quietly when she'd finished eating. "Family, friends." "The police?" Natalie had flinched at the last word, shaking her head violently. "No police, please, I just need—" She'd stopped, her face working through emotions too complex to name. I just need one night. One night where no one knows where I am, where I can breathe. Is that okay? Can I stay here tonight? I'll leave in the morning, I promise. I just need... You can stay, Daniel had said immediately. You can stay as long as you need. The guest room is upstairs, second door on the left. Clean sheets, everything you need. Or you can stay down here if you'd rather. Whatever feels safest. She'd chosen the couch and he'd understood. The guest room would have meant closing a door, being alone, being vulnerable in sleep. The couch meant staying in the open, meant being able to see who was coming, meant easier escape if needed. Daniel had given her blankets and pillows, had built up the fire in the fireplace even though the house's heating worked fine, because sometimes warmth was more than temperature. It was light and sound and the primal comfort of flames keeping the darkness at bay. He'd settled into the armchair across from her, close enough to help if needed, far enough to not be threatening. Thank you, she'd whispered into the firelit darkness. You don't know what this means. You can't know. Maybe I do, Daniel had replied softly. A little, anyway. My sister left a bad relationship 3 years ago. She showed up at my door in the middle of the night, too. Different circumstances, maybe, but the same look in her eyes. That look that says you're not sure the world has any safe places left in it. Natalie had turned her head toward him then, really looking at him for the first time. Is she okay now? Your sister? She is. It took time and work, and a lot of days where she wasn't sure she'd make it. But she found her way through. She's happy now. Really happy. She runs her own business, has a partner who treats her like she hung the moon, laughs like she never forgot how. He'd paused, meeting her eyes across the fire-lit space. I'm telling you this because I want you to know that whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, there's a way through. You're not alone in this, even if it feels like you are. Tears had slipped down Natalie's cheeks then, silent and steady. She hadn't tried to hide them or wipe them away, had just let them fall while she held his gaze. I'm Natalie, she'd said. I don't know if I told you that yet. My name is Natalie Reeves, and I'm 30 years old, and 6 months ago I had a whole different life. A husband, a house in the suburbs, a job at an accounting firm. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Everyone thought I had it all figured out. Her voice had gone flat, distant. From the inside, I was dying. Slowly, piece by piece, day by day. Daniel had waited, not pushing, letting her control the pace and depth of what she shared. His name was Brandon. We met at work 5 years ago. He was charming, successful, attentive in ways that felt like love but were actually surveillance. I didn't see it at first. No one ever does, do they? The control disguised as care, the jealousy disguised as devotion. By the time I understood what was happening, I was already trapped. No access to money. No friends left because he'd driven them all away. My family thought I'd just gotten too busy for them, too wrapped up in my successful marriage to stay in touch. She'd pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her voice dropping lower. It started with words, comments about my appearance, my intelligence, my worth. Then it became restrictions. Don't wear that, don't talk to him, don't go there without me. Then isolation. Then came the first time he grabbed me hard enough to bruise. Then the pushing. Then worse. Daniel's hands had clenched into fists on the arms of his chair. Rage for this woman he didn't know. Rage at a man he'd never met, burning hot in his chest. But he'd kept his voice gentle. How did you get out? I started planning 6 months ago. Stealing $20 here, $50 there whenever I could. Hiding it in a tampon box because I knew he'd never look there. Creating a secret email account at the library. Gathering copies of documents. Learning the pattern of when he worked late, when I'd have the most time. She'd taken a shaky breath. Yesterday, he went on a business trip. Usually he takes my phone when he travels, but this time he forgot. And I knew it was my chance. My only chance. So I took everything I'd hidden, I got in my car, and I drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove until I couldn't anymore. Until the adrenaline wore off and the reality of what I'd done hit me, and I had to pull over because I was shaking too hard to see the road. That's when the storm started, Daniel had said quietly, understanding now. Natalie had nodded. I was parked outside a coffee shop 3 blocks from here. Watched the rain start, watched it get worse, and I thought maybe I should just stay in the car. Maybe I should just wait it out. But then I saw people inside the coffee shop, warm and safe, and I thought about Brandon realizing I was gone. Thought about him calling me or tracking my phone or whatever he'd do first, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't breathe, and the car felt like a coffin, and I just started walking. She'd looked at him then with those storm-colored eyes, raw with exhaustion and lingering fear, and something that might have been the first fragile shoots of relief. I walked for an hour in the rain. Didn't know where I was going. Then I saw your house, saw the light in your window, and I don't know what made me come to your door. Desperation, probably. Or insanity. Or maybe I just needed to know if there were still good people in the world. People who'd help without expecting something in return. There are, Daniel had said. There are good people. You found one. And tomorrow we'll figure out next steps. We'll make a plan. But tonight you sleep. Tonight you're safe. And she had slept eventually. Daniel had watched her slip into restless dreams. Watched the way even in sleep she remained partially alert, her body never fully releasing its tension. He'd stayed awake all night feeding the fire, listening to the storm rage outside, marveling at the strange twist of fate that had brought this broken, brave woman to his door. Now in the morning light, with Natalie standing in his living room wearing his sweater and looking at him like he was some kind of hero when he was just a man who'd opened a door, Daniel felt the full weight of what had happened. This wasn't just about one night of shelter. This was about a woman who'd risked everything to escape, who'd placed her trust in a stranger because she had no other choice, who was standing here now asking for something as simple and as complicated as a chance to know him better. Pancakes, he said again, smiling, trying to lighten the heavy air between them, and then we talk about what comes next. Sound good? Natalie smiled back, tentative but real. Sounds perfect. As they moved toward the kitchen, as Daniel pulled out flour and eggs and Natalie perched on a bar stool watching him work with curious eyes, something shifted between them. The desperate urgency of the night before softened into something gentler. Possibility, connection, the kind of easy comfort that usually took months to build but sometimes, in extraordinary circumstances, arrived fully formed like a gift. Daniel cooked and Natalie talked. Small things at first, safe things. Her favorite color was teal. She'd wanted to be a marine biologist when she was young. Had loved the ocean with a passion that had gotten lost somewhere in the years of becoming an adult, of making practical choices, of losing herself in someone else's vision of who she should be. She missed her mother, who died when Natalie was 25. Missed her with an ache that had never fully healed. In return, Daniel shared pieces of himself. His love of old books and older jazz, the workshop in his garage where he restored furniture, finding meditation in the careful work of sanding and staining. His sister Rosa, who was fierce and funny and had taught him that strength looked like a lot of different things, including asking for help when you needed it. They ate pancakes at his small kitchen table, the morning sun streaming through the window, turning everything golden. Natalie had 3 helpings, eating with the focused intensity of someone who'd been running on empty for too long. Daniel watched her slowly relax, watched the rigid set of her shoulders ease, watched color return to her cheeks. What happens now? She asked finally, pushing her empty plate away. Realistically, I mean. I have some money, enough for maybe a week or 2 in a cheap hotel. I need to find work, somewhere he can't trace me to. I need to disappear. Daniel set down his fork, thinking carefully before speaking. You could stay here, just for a while until you get your feet under you. I have the space. The guest room is just sitting empty. It wouldn't be charity, it would be... He paused, searching for the right words. It would be one human helping another human. No strings, no expectations. Just a safe place to land while you figure things out. Natalie stared at him, her eyes filling with tears again. Why would you do that? Why would you risk getting involved in my mess? Because maybe I'm supposed to, Daniel said simply. Because you knocked on my door in the middle of a storm, and that feels like it means something. Because my sister didn't have anyone when she ran, and she told me once that she'd never forget that loneliness, that terror of having nowhere to go. Because you're brave and you deserve better than constantly looking over your shoulder, and maybe I can help give you enough time and space to start building something new. I don't know how to accept this, Natalie whispered. I don't know how to let someone help without waiting for the catch, for the moment it all turns dark. There's no catch, Daniel promised. Just time. Just space. Just the chance to heal. And in exchange, all I ask is that you don't give up, that you keep fighting for the life you deserve. Natalie nodded slowly, tears spilling over. Okay, she breathed. Okay, for a week or 2, just until I find something else, just until I'm steady enough to stand on my own. But they both knew, sitting there in the golden morning light with empty plates between them, and a future neither could quite predict, that a week or two would become longer, that this accidental collision of two lives would become something neither had planned for, but both desperately needed, that sometimes the most important people entered your life in the most unexpected ways, and the only thing to do was hold on and see where the current took you. Learning to stay 3 weeks passed like a held breath, suspended between what had been and what might be. Natalie moved into the guest room upstairs, a space Daniel had hastily tried to make welcoming, hanging cheerful curtains and clearing out the boxes of old textbooks that had been accumulating in the corners. She lived lightly at first, as if ready to flee at any moment, keeping her few belongings in a single bag by the door, sleeping on top of the covers instead of under them, moving through the house like a ghost who'd forgotten she had substance. Daniel gave her space, gave her time, gave her the gift of asking for nothing while offering everything. He left for work in the mornings and came home to find her exactly where he'd left her, usually curled in the armchair by the window with a book from his shelf, or standing in the kitchen staring at vegetables like she'd forgotten what to do with them. They existed in careful parallel, two people sharing a space but not yet sharing a life, both waiting for something neither could name. It was Rosa who finally broke through. Daniel's sister arrived one Sunday morning with her characteristic whirlwind energy, carrying bags of groceries and a determination to meet the mysterious woman her brother had mentioned only briefly, trying to sound casual when he was anything but. "So you're Natalie," Rosa had said, sweeping into the house with a smile that could melt glaciers. She was small and fierce, with Daniel's same dark eyes but a confidence he'd never quite managed. "I'm Rosa, the annoying little sister who refuses to call before visiting. Danny says you're staying here while you get back on your feet." "Good. He needs someone to cook for besides himself. The man lives on sandwiches and denial." Natalie had blinked, caught off guard by the friendly assault by the assumption of welcome instead of interrogation. "I don't want to intrude," she'd started, but Rosa had waved a hand dismissively. "Please, intrude. This house has been too quiet for too long. Now come help me make tamales, because if I do it alone, my abuela's ghost will haunt me for doing it wrong, and I need a witness to testify that I tried my best." And somehow, in the alchemy of Rosa's easy warmth and the meditative rhythm of preparing food, Natalie had started to thaw. Her hands had remembered how to move with purpose, folding masa around, filling with growing confidence. Her voice had grown steadier as Rosa pulled out stories, not by asking direct questions that might trigger defenses, but by sharing her own stories, her own struggles, her own journey from broken to whole. "I was with someone once," Rosa had said casually, her hands working the dough. "Someone who made me believe I was lucky he'd chosen me, that I should be grateful for his attention, even when that attention felt like a spotlight I couldn't escape, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt, because isn't that what love is? Sacrifice, pain, putting someone else's needs above your own until you forget you have needs at all." Natalie's hands had stilled. "What made you leave?" "My brother," Rosa had said, glancing at Daniel, who was pretending not to listen while chopping onions with unnecessary focus. "He showed up at the apartment one day when my ex wasn't there. I'd been avoiding him for months because I knew what he'd see, knew he'd ask questions I didn't want to answer. But there he was, and he took one look at me and said, 'We're pack a bag. You're coming with me now.'" "Were you angry?" Natalie had asked quietly. "Furious," Rosa had admitted. "I yelled at him, told him he was overreacting, that he didn't understand that things weren't that bad. I defended the man who was destroying me because admitting the truth felt like admitting I'd wasted years of my life on someone who never loved me the way I deserved to be." Loved. She'd met Natalie's eyes then, her own dark and knowing, but Danny didn't argue. He just sat in my apartment and waited. 4 hours he waited, and finally I packed that bag. "And then what?" Natalie had whispered. "And then I learned that leaving was just the beginning. That the hard part wasn't the dramatic escape, it was the everyday work of rebuilding, of learning to trust again, starting with trusting myself, of remembering who I was before I became what someone else wanted me to be." Rosa had smiled, sad and wise. "It took 2 years before I felt like a real person again instead of a collection of defenses and fears. But I got there, and now I look back at that version of me, the one who was too scared to leave, and I just want to reach back through time and tell her that she's stronger than she knows." Natalie had ducked her head, tears dropping onto the cutting board in front of her. "What if I'm not strong enough? You knocked on a stranger's door in the middle of a storm rather than give up, Rosa had said firmly. You drove away from a man who'd spent years teaching you that you couldn't survive without him, and you proved him wrong just by breathing. You're sitting here in my brother's kitchen, learning to make tamales and talking about things that hurt instead of running away or shutting down. If that's not strength, I don't know what is. Something had shifted in Natalie that day, not a complete transformation. Those happened in books, not real life, but a subtle softening. A small step toward believing she might deserve the safety she'd found. She'd started joining Daniel and Rosa for their weekly dinners, started offering her own stories in exchange for theirs, started laughing at Rosa's terrible jokes and Daniel's worse attempts to one-up her. She'd started leaving her bag unpacked, hanging clothes in the closet Daniel had cleared for her, started sleeping under the covers instead of on top of them, started cooking meals without asking permission first, filling the house with smells that made it feel like a home instead of a shelter. Started existing in the present instead of constantly watching the door, waiting for her past to catch up. And through it all, Daniel watched her bloom like a flower that had been kept in darkness finally finding sun. He watched her discover his collection of old vinyl records and spend entire afternoons listening to Billie Holiday and Nina Simone, eyes closed, swaying slightly to music that seemed to reach past her defenses straight into some locked-away part of her soul. He watched her start sketching on scraps of paper she found around the house, abstract designs at first, then faces, then landscapes that looked like memories or maybe dreams. He noticed when she started smiling more easily, when her default expression shifted from guarded to curious, noticed when she started touching things in his house, not nervously but with appreciation, running her fingers along the spines of his books or the grain of the wooden table his grandfather had built. Noticed when she started wearing colors instead of the grays and blacks she'd arrived in, a soft green sweater that made her eyes look more blue than gray, a yellow cardigan that made her seem to glow from within. What he tried not to notice, but couldn't help noticing, was the way his heart had started rearranging itself around her presence, the way he found himself hurrying home from work instead of staying late in his office, the way her laugh, rare but genuine, had become his favorite sound in the world. The way he'd started thinking in terms of we instead of I, planning weekend activities that might interest her, buying groceries with her preferences in mind, existing in the shared space of their accidental domesticity with a contentment he hadn't felt in years. He tried to keep it hidden, this growing feeling that was too big and too complicated to examine closely. She was healing. She was vulnerable. The last thing she needed was the pressure of someone else's feelings, someone else's expectations. So Daniel kept his distance, kept things friendly and light, pretended his heart didn't skip when she smiled at him over morning coffee, or when she fell asleep on the couch during movie nights, and he got to watch her sleep peacefully, unafraid, trusting him enough to let down every guard. But Natalie wasn't blind. She felt it too, this thing growing between them, this connection that was part gratitude and part recognition. Like two pieces of a puzzle discovering they fit together in ways neither had expected. She saw the way Daniel looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, saw the gentleness in every interaction, the careful respect for her boundaries, the way he made her feel safe not by demanding nothing but by offering everything, and asking for nothing in return except that she keep trying, keep healing, keep choosing life over the alternative.